And now, from the University of Virginia Center for Politics.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this special last-minute event hosted by the University of Virginia Center for Politics in partnership with the UVA Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies and the UVA European Studies program. My name is Chris Krebs. I'm currently a resident scholar at the Center for Politics. I'm also a 1999 graduate of the College of Arts and Sciences and a graduate of the George Mason Antonin Scalia Law School up here in Arlington, Virginia. I also recently served as the director of the U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency in the U.S. government, and now I'm also partner at the Krebs Stamos Group, a technology and geopolitical risk management consultancy. So today we've got two fantastic panelists that have a sense of both the past, the present, and the future of what's going on in Ukraine and the Russian invasion. Our first panelist for the discussion is Dr. Alina Polyakova. She's president and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis, as well as an adjunct professor of European Studies at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced and International Studies. Dr. Polyakova is a recognized expert on transatlantic relations, European security, Russian foreign policy, digital authoritarianism, and populism in democracies. She's the author of the book, The Dark Side of European Integration, which examines the rise of far-right political movements in Europe, as well as dozens of major reports and articles in major publications. She's a frequent commentator in major media outlets such as Fox News, CNN, and BBC, and she's also a friend of mine. Dr. Polyakova holds a PhD in MA in sociology from the University of California. The University of California, Berkeley, and a BA in economics and sociology from Emory University. Our next guest is Professor Jeffrey Rossman. He is the director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies and associate professor of history at the university. His research is focused on the Stalin period, with his most recent publications focusing on the Great Terror of 1937 and 1938. Thank you both for participating in this timely discussion today. So I think I know that as I watch the news, I look on social media, and I try to digest what's happening right now. Most of this is really quite hard to comprehend. It's hard to understand that 30 years after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, we actually, in fact, have Russian troops assaulting a European capital city, and tanks are in the streets. These are things that I don't think many or any of us really thought we would see again. So today I'd like to talk to you both about how we got here, how this all ends, and what does it mean for Russia's relationship with the West. So let's start with some history, and Jeff, I think this is kind of your wheelhouse. But from a context perspective of Russia and Ukraine, Vladimir Putin gave a rather long speech the other day on Monday. It was in Russian, of course, but it was live translated for those that are not fluent. And of course, there was a subsequent transcription of the speech. So for the first hour or so, it seemed to have been a history of Russia from the imperial times through the Soviet Union to today. And as I was listening to the live translation, I was taken by his framing of history and decisions made by prior leaders, in particularly Lenin, but also he talked about Ukraine as if it was not a real country, invoked Lenin, he invoked Stalin, he decried Lenin's decision in 1917 to allow Ukraine to establish itself as a country. He talked about Stalin's decisions giving other lands to Ukraine and Khrushchev. And so, there's a lot to unpack here. Can you help us understand where he was trying to go, and maybe walk us through Ukraine's history with Russia, whether that's control of the territory, the ancestry of the people, their languages, their culture. So can you help us get to the bottom of what's going on historically? Did we lose Jeff? All right. Jeff is frozen. Jeff will come back on. And So we'll have Alina jump in the meantime.
All right. Well, I'm happy to give you my sense of the historical rant that we heard from Russia's president earlier this week. I mean, one, while I'm not a historian, I think every historian, including Jeff, when he comes back, will probably agree that this was a completely absurd revisionist retelling of history that basically ended with the idea that because Ukraine, what is currently Ukraine, in the past for hundreds of years, like many other European countries, have been comprised of various parts of warring, ruling empires, that for that reason, Ukraine has no right to exist as a sovereign nation state. I mean, this is, of course, akin to, let's say, the UK going back to India and saying, you were carved out of a couple of different territories, you have no right to exist, so we're back, as well as any other colonial power or imperial power like the Ottoman Empire. Suddenly, Erdogan saying we're back and we're going to reclaim our territories. So this is, of course, completely absurd. It felt a bit unhinged listening to Russia's president deliver that kind of view of history, which is, of course, completely inaccurate. But this is what he used to justify what we now have been watching as the brutal military invasion of a sovereign country in Europe for the first time since World War II.
Well, we have Jeff back with us. Jeff, so I'm not sure how much of the kind of context setting you
got it. Yeah.
Can you give us a little bit of a history of the sense of the relationship between Russia and Ukraine over the last 100 years or even more?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a troubled history, and one marked certainly by conflict. And I was struck by what you said, Chris, in listening to Putin's speech. Is there's almost more anger at previous Russian and Soviet leaders than there is towards the West. Like that really came across strongly in his speech. So I heard part of what Alina mentioned, and of course I agree completely with that. So Ukrainian national identity, like a lot of, like most national identities in Europe, emerges in the 19th century, and it was perceived as a threat to the Russian Empire, to a unitary state. So for 40 years, beginning in the 1860s, the Ukrainian language was banned. No publications in Ukrainian. And so, to some extent, that hindered the development of the language. But nonetheless, national identity developed, at least among the sort of intelligentsia, if you will. And so, we actually see independence for Ukraine during the Russian Civil War, and even before the Bolsheviks come to power in July 1917. One of the provisional government, one version of it, collapses precisely over the Ukraine issue, because the socialist ministers are being a little bit more willing to negotiate with Ukrainian leaders, and the liberals are concerned about that, and they want to hold off on the national question until there's a constituent assembly. Then Ukraine gets its independence, but of course, a lot of that comes out of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which was the treaty Lenin signed with the Germans. They're defeated, and then of course Germany is defeated, and then of course Ukraine becomes ground zero for much of the Civil War. Ukraine has several years of independence. So the idea that it's a pure creation of the Soviet Union is completely nonsense, because the national identity was already in place. It is true that the Lenin and then Stalin for a while allowed national identities to flourish. The idea was this was an anti-imperial regime, and that they were going to let national groups flourish so long as they were loyal to the socialist project. That was okay. And in fact, that was going to be attractive to Ukrainians across the border, because part of Ukraine was outside of the Soviet Union. That changes in 1932 during the Great Famine, when Stalin has literally a moment when he starts to see what he perceives to be Ukrainian national identity as no longer being something that could be a positive for the Soviet Union, but could actually lead to separatism. And he thus then weaponizes the famine, which was unintended result of collectivization. He weaponizes it in Ukraine, essentially triggering what many historians would now call a genocide. And it wasn't just a war against the peasantry, it was a war against the Ukrainian intelligentsia, to some extent the Ukrainian language, which could no longer be taught outside of Soviet Ukraine. And because the famine wiped out much of the peasantry, entire districts were then settled with ethnic Russians. So the actual demographic content of some of the districts in Ukraine were changed by the regime. So it's a history in which we see periods of flourishing identity where that was okay with the center, and then periods where Ukrainian national identity is perceived to be a threat. So I'll stop there. I don't want to lecture too long on that, but that kind of gives maybe a quick overview of some of the themes.
It does, and it gives us that again the context for the relationship between the two countries, and it reminds me of a tweet I saw the other day from the U.S. Embassy Kiev, and it was the first time that I'd seen. I think, Alina, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was meme war, right? It's the first time I've seen a diplomatic mission like that take a picture or a meme, a GIF that posted a picture of Kiev in 1100 AD, and then juxtaposed against the same time frame in Moscow. And of course, in 1100, Moscow is still just a river and a forest, but Kiev had been established, was a vibrant, thriving city with its own culture. So I think that speaks to your earlier point, Jeff. So, but Alina, so what do we think the point of this was then? If he's manufacturing this alternative history, is this pretext? Like, what do we think is going on here? What is he trying to establish?
Well, we've heard similar revisions of history from Mr. Putin himself. He, of course, published an article, a very long article, making the same points about Ukraine's really having no valid right to exist as a state. And this speech that we're talking about now very much repeated the same points that we heard him make, that we saw him make in the article he published just last year. And so this kind of narrative, that Ukraine is not a real state, that Ukraine is just part of Russia and always has been, which is of course false. I loved that U.S. Embassy tweet. I thought it was brilliant. That kind of trope, that kind of narrative has been very, very common on Russian media. So this is what many Russians have been hearing for years now. And of course, has been repeated by Mr. Putin, everyone around him. So this whole idea that Ukrainians are just little Russians, the Ukrainian language isn't a real language, and this kind of these kinds of words, these kinds of concepts that are frequently applied to Ukraine, that's been just part of the Russian milieu and Russian thinking for a very long time. So the question is, why did he go back to that now? Well, I don't know what goes on in Mr. Putin's head, but it seemed to me, just looking at his posture, looking at his how he delivered the speech, that it was not written beforehand, that he was speaking kind of off the cuff, and that he genuinely believes what he's saying, which is, of course, deeply disturbing. And I think from that perspective, if we take that as a potential reality, then that was a basic declaration of war against Ukraine, saying this country cannot exist and will not exist. And we've seen that kind of action, of course, take place shortly afterwards.
So building on a bit more of the more recent statements and trying to kind of anchor against a historical context rather, I've heard things that I didn't think I would hear, frankly, ever again. There's a lot of framing of the Ukrainian leadership as Nazis or neo-Nazis in a fascist state. So, Jeff, do you have anything you'd want to add here? You're a specialist in genocide, particularly of the Stalin era. What is it about Russia and the Third Reich and Nazis that is such a powerful view that they're trying to evoke?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, of course, obviously those accusations are completely absurd. So World War II, right? The Soviet Union, loses globally. The Soviet Union loses about half of the global deaths in World War II, about 27 million out of 55 million globally. So obviously, right, the conflict with Nazi Germany plays a huge part it played a huge part in Soviet identity, and then obviously today in Russian identity. So in effort to dehumanize your victims, right, to call a group Nazis is the worst sort of negative term that you could use towards them. So it's an absurd claim, obviously. Where does it come from? What's the sort of, if you will, kernel of truth, historical truth that they're trying to exploit? So the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, which was pursuing Ukrainian independence under Stepan Bandera, does ally with Nazi Germany in an effort to secure Ukrainian independence. Eventually, Bandera actually falls afoul of the Nazi regime and ends up in a concentration camp. But the OUN, its more radical ultranationalist elements, did favor and participate in ethnic cleansing, pogroms against Jews, Poles in particular, in the wartime period. So the legacy of Bandera and the OUN is very, very difficult and a source of a lot of controversy, including in Ukraine. Some would say Bandera was a genuine national hero. Others disagree with that. So the modern Ukrainian state has vacillated on the relationship to Bandera, and during the periods of greater liberalization and Western-oriented governments in Ukraine, there have been efforts to publicly honor Bandera, to posthumously award him and acknowledge him as a Ukrainian national hero. So, of course, this has been seized upon, including domestically within Ukraine, by those who disagree with it, as a sign of trying to rehabilitate a sympathizer with the fascists. So that's the sort of kernel of historical truth that they're trying to exploit. There was this fusion of ultranational Ukrainian identity for a relatively brief period in history that Putin's using to dehumanize his adversaries.
And yet today, Ukraine is clearly a pro-European democracy. That movement was going quite strong till about 2013 and 14. What happened, either of you? What happened in 14 with Yanukovych pulling back from the accord or whatever was to be signed with Europe? What was so significant about 2014, and then what did that kind of spur?
Well, I can start us. Yeah, sure. I can start us off, but if I may, I wanted to go back to this historical question that Jeff was just addressing, because it's so important. I stepped off screen for a second because I was trying to find a T-shirt I had made in 2014 when I was in Kiev that said "Zhyda Banderivka," which means I'll explain what that means, because what we've seen over and over again is that if we can talk about a founding myth for the Russian state and for the Soviet state, it is World War II and the Soviet states' defeat of fascist Germany. And of course, if you live in the Soviet Union, as I did at one point in my life, you don't refer to that as World War II, you refer to that as the Great Patriotic War, the war for the homeland. And so every year when I was a child, and this continues in Russia today, there are these mass patriotic nationalist marches and demonstrations on Victory Day in May, when everyone is reminded how Russia is great because Russia's defeated the fascists, not the Soviet Union anymore, just Russia. When, of course, the majority of deaths happen in Ukraine. All we have to do is look at Tim Snyder's book, Bloodlands, Ukraine, Belarus. This area was the one that suffered the most from the conflict between fascist Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front. But what's been fascinating is to watch how the Kremlin continues to use these tropes about, on the one hand, protecting Jews, but then on the other hand, calling Ukrainians fascists and calling what happened in 2014 as a fascist coup. And then on the other hand, mixing all together and saying there's a Jewish conspiracy in Ukraine, right? So this completely absurd, surreal, nonsensical world has emerged in kind of the Russian psyche, where you both have fascists and Jews who are driving Ukraine away from Russia. And because Jeff was talking about Bandera, this historical and very controversial character in Ukraine, there was kind of a merger, and this became a real joke in Ukraine in 2014 and continues to this day, where we saw a lot of Ukrainian Jews actually join militias, right, to support the resistance when the protests became quite violent later in 2014. And I don't want to say I can't necessarily, but I'll say it because in Russian, the derogatory term in Russian for Jews is Zhid. And then people who were followers of Bandera are called Banderivtsi. And so these were combined, and Ukrainians appropriated this, and Jewish Ukrainians who supported Ukrainian independence called themselves Zhyda Banderivtsi. So it basically means fascist Jews, because that's what the Russians have been calling them. And this is really absurd because it continues to this day. even though Ukraine has had a Jewish president who was democratically elected by a landslide. So just the absurdity of how Mr. Putin and Russian narratives play with these historical ideas, it really just creates a lot of confusion and obfuscates from the reality. Mm-hmm. But very quickly to go back to your direct question in 2014, because this is really where I was going with this. You know, what really happened started in 2013, in the fall of 2013, which is when we saw some Ukrainian students demonstrating on the Kiev Central Square, the Maidan. And what were they demonstrating for or against? This is, I think, really important context, because in hindsight, we tend to think that the war in Ukraine started in 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea. But we don't forget why that happened. And the Russian narrative has been that Ukraine wanted to join NATO, and there's all these other ideas out there, but they're all false. They're all basic lies. Because actually what happened is that late in 2013, these students were demonstrating because they wanted closer relationships with Ukraine and Europe. They were demonstrating under EU flags. NATO had nothing to do with it. In fact, in 2013, there was not a lot of popular support for joining NATO. Ukraine was de facto a neutral country. But at the time, the president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, a very corrupt individual loyal to Moscow, had basically cut off trade negotiations for a free trade agreement with the EU, and said he was going to take this 40 billion deal from the Russians to closer tie Ukrainians and Russian economies. And this is when the protests began. So there were pro-European protests against Ukraine's further move towards Russia. And then, of course, as that unfolded, that became known as the Revolution of Dignity. And then, of course, Yanukovych, after all these protests were unfolding, fled to Russia, where he remains today in some obscure place. We don't know exactly where. And we had a new election. They elected a democratically elected president. But at the same time, of course, Russia took advantage of the political situation and invaded Crimea, which still occupies, and then invaded the Donbass in eastern Ukraine as well.
So let me just get this straight to make sure we're all on the same page, right? Despite claims from the Kremlin, Ukraine is in fact a real country, right? That's what I'm hearing both of you say. Okay.
Yes.
it is truly absurd, some of the narratives, the tropes, as you put it, that have been established. So before I think we move on to today's conflict, Jeff, maybe is there any significance of the partnership between Russia and Belarus? We're hearing claims of troops coming out of, Russian troops in Belarus. I've heard the term before, the great, the white, and the little. What is that historical nexus that going on there?
Well, part of it is, this 19th century ideology that the Slavic peoples, right, the Russians, the Ukrainians, the Belarusians, that they constituted one people, maybe with little, folkloric distinctions between them, but basically we're one people. And that's, at some level, that's the ideology that Putin is pursuing. And so there was a formal union created between Belarus and Russia in the 1990s, which was pretty much a dead letter. And Lukashenko, sort of played the West and played Moscow off each other to try to maintain some advantages in his relations with each. But obviously that all changed in 2020 when he overwhelmingly lost a presidential election, mass protests, and then Putin sent in security police in order to help him put down those protests and crush that. And that seems to be, the MO now at some level of Russia, right? They sent in troops down to Kazakhstan recently, also to help put down a popular uprising at some level, although it has some distinctions which we won't get into here. But that seems to be the sort of mode, is that Russia's going to be the force that's going to come in and hold together these authoritarian regimes on its periphery. It seems like a pretty fragile way to maintain influence in what Russia calls the near abroad. But that seems to be the MO right now.
Yeah, and as I look at it, I think there are a lot of questions about where does this end? Does it end in Kiev, or are we moving into the Transnistria region of Moldova? What's next for the Baltics? We've heard some some activity there and some concerns of operations in the Baltics as well. So let's, I'm kind of putting us in a time machine a little bit here. We've gone back into the 1860s. We've talked about 2014, but it seems to me one of the more pivotal phases of recent history, at least, that have taken us to where we are today is 1991. So the collapse of the Soviet Union, NATO expansion into former Soviet Union states or Soviet republics. Jeff, can you give us a bit of the NATO background, the NATO expansion in the 90s and even into the 2000s of the different phases? Like, why is there such a concern about ultimately what's a defensive alliance in Ukraine's potential or perhaps not even non-existent participation in the alliance?
Yeah, and so just before saying this, I want to say obviously nothing that I'm about to say justifies anything along the lines of a war against Ukraine. But I think there are genuine security concerns that were foreseen very early on with NATO expansion, and that debate took place within the U.S. government, and certainly it was a concern very early on in the Russian government. So at some level, some kind of revanchism, I think, was foreseen. And I have a quote here from George Kennan, obviously the architect of containment, one of the greatest 20th century diplomats, who opposed NATO expansion. And in 1997, he said, bluntly stated, expanding NATO would be the most fateful error of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era. Such a decision may be expected to inflame the nationalistic, anti-Western, and militaristic tendencies in Russian opinion, to have an adverse effect on the development of Russian democracy, to restore the atmosphere of the Cold War to East-West relations, and to impel Russian foreign policy in directions decidedly not to our liking. End quote. So he was right on all those things, and that's not to say that each of those things that he talks about were caused entirely by NATO expansion. But in my Russian Soviet history course, I put up a map. And I show a map of current day Russia and the alliance, the NATO alliance, and how close it is to their borders. Then I have this other imaginary map which shows what would it be like if Canada and Mexico were part of the Warsaw Pact. Would the United States accept that? Would we feel threatened? And I think students say that would be kind of scary. And so it was foreseen, and across the political spectrum in Russia, liberals to nationalists warned Washington that this would have a negative effect on Russian outlook, and it was perceived as not in Russia's interest. Then there were specific moments, and it's not just all the U.S.'s fault in this regard. Russia made, as Mary Serrati points out in sort of the definitive history, which has just recently been published about this, Russia made some very important mistakes that frightened Eastern Europeans, the Chechen War being one case. But then so too did the NATO alliance. The first thing done right after NATO expansion was bombing of a Slavic country, Kosovo, in 1999. This was a watershed moment for Russians, and a lot of them felt like this sort of put the lie to the assurances that this is strictly a defensive alliance. Now, obviously, the principle behind the bombing of Kosovo was a humanitarian one, but nonetheless, it rained a tremendous amount of destruction on the infrastructure of Serbia. So, moments like that have played a strong role in really helping to set in a deep skepticism and antagonism towards NATO expansion. And have there been some legitimate security concerns there? I think that there have been, given that Russia has an unprotected western frontier, and that has always been a significant concern for Russia historically, with invasions obviously coming from that direction in the 19th century and the 20th century. So would this today be happening anyway, regardless? It's hard to say, right? Because there's multi-causality happening here too. But as Professor Serrati points out, it's not so much maybe that NATO expansion happened, but the way that it happened in a manner that really did seem to be antagonizing to Russia. It was a kind of a maximalist approach, an all or nothing approach, as opposed to perhaps a more gradual approach. that arguably could have had something of a difference. But there were many other factors that led to the breakdown of Russian-U.S. relations and to the collapse of democracy within Russia. But NATO expansion is clearly one of those factors.
Well, so within a similar sort of NATO expansion context, Alina, what is your view of not just what the concerns on the Russian side are, but from the NATO perspective, from the Ukrainian perspective, how do we put this into the complete context?
Sure. Well, I think we've been having this debate for far too long, and in some ways, it's no longer relevant given Russia's brutal military invasion of Ukraine that we're seeing unfold. That's killing civilians in significant numbers. So, one point I would make is that I think Mr. Putin has the wrong enemy in mind. He should be angry with Gorbachev, who never secured written guarantees for NATO non-expansion. There's this big debate happening. What was Gorbachev told about NATO expansion, not expansion back when the Soviet Union was falling apart? Well, there was a negotiating process and many things were discussed. But at the end of the day, Russia signed the agreements. Russia also was a signatory to the Budapest Memorandum, which in 1994 basically meant that Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, which many Ukrainians regret today, of course, in exchange for security guarantees from Russia. So we have to just remember that Russia made these decisions. NATO expansion, I think, is a very misleading term as well, because NATO doesn't just, it's not a land-grabbing imperial power. Countries have to petition to join NATO. They have to meet very strict requirements to be able to be part of the NATO community. To have interoperable military capabilities with the rest of NATO's member states, and to contribute 2%, which most of the new member states do, whereas countries like Germany don't, to their defense spending. So I think the narrative that we have been hearing for a long time is very much tinged by, frankly, Russian propaganda about their view as being the victim of so-called NATO aggression expansion. And fine, you can look at all the maps you want, but there were conversations about Russia eventually maybe even joining NATO. That was a conversation that happened with Yeltsin at one point. Of course, that could have been a possibility had Russia not continued to see, and the hardliners of Russia not continued to see NATO as an aggressive, offensive organization. And also in the Balkans, Russia eventually did cooperate and work together with the United States as related to the NATO efforts there to bring peace and stability to the region. So, there's a much more complex history and much more nuanced than we're led to believe, of course, when we hear the Russian narrative on this. So I don't want to get off too far, of course, but the idea that there was an expansionist NATO policy, all or nothing, all or nothing would have been Ukraine and Georgia and the rest of the post-Soviet states. That's not where we landed. And frankly, given everything the Kremlin has done, is, to my mind and to many people's mind, just confirms the case for more NATO expansion, because these countries were terrified of Russian aggression. That's why they petitioned to join. And I guarantee you, if the Baltics were not in NATO, they would have frozen conflicts on their borders, and we'd be looking at Russian invasion of the Baltic states as we speak. So in some ways, NATO membership has been the security umbrella that we needed to keep peace and prosperity and growth in Europe for all of these decades. And the countries that didn't join NATO, Georgia, we had a Russian war in Georgia in 2008, Armenia, Azerbaijan, we have Nagorno-Karabakh. In Moldova, we have Transnistria. And of course, we know what's happened in Ukraine. So very, very clear what the lesson has been in terms of NATO membership. NATO provides security. And if you're not a NATO member state, then Russia invades you.
Yeah, just to push back on that a little bit, because this is actually another thing George Kennan warned about. He said that what's going to happen is NATO is going to expand to the borders of Russia, and then it's going to provoke precisely the response in Russia that then people will say, see, NATO expansion was justified. And I think that is part of what we've seen. I mean, not to disagree with, obviously, today it's important for the Baltic states, but it was actually the inclusion of the Baltic states, the inclusion of former Soviet regions, that was a particularly sensitive issue for Russia. But be that as it may, it's the reality that we have now, and certainly for those states that are within the NATO umbrella. it is. I would agree that there would be frozen conflicts in the Baltics as well at this juncture. So it's a complex history, I think, is one way to look at it.
Yeah, and I think as you look at what's happened over the last 24 hours elsewhere in Europe, and some of the signals coming from Finland and Sweden, but that they would be, as promised, open to immediate accession into NATO if NATO offered. So, in a certain sense, it's possible that this is backfiring. And of course, you've heard from the Kremlin that any additional expansion to include Finland or others would be met, would be seen as an escalation. So it's, the escalation ladder and the theory of what is escalatory. But let me unpack one more piece. And Alina, you mentioned a couple different agreements that were signed. I've heard of an agreement that was a verbal agreement, but there was no paper. Am I mishearing? A misunderstanding? Was there something that wasn't documented? Allegedly?
I mean, going back to this whole debate, this was a conversation that happened with Schultz at the time, who was negotiating on East Germany's future. This was the conversation that was happening, was Germany reunification, which actually happened before the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And the big conversation that was happening was, what will happen to the DDR, the East Germany that was controlled by the Soviet Union at the time, after the Berlin Wall fell. And eventually, and this is also Mary Sarate's book that really outlines how this took place. Eventually the model of just East Germany being fully integrated into West Germany and all the institutions that came with, including NATO, became the model. So this conversation that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward, that was the phrase the Russians keep going back to over and over again, was part of a conversation that happened in the context of German reunification. And again, the Russians had an opportunity there. They could have taken that and said, you said this, we're going to hold you to, but they didn't. And so this was a strategic mistake in terms of how we understand Russia's security interests, that they failed to get anything written on. So I'm sorry, but your leaders made a strategic error, just like our leaders make strategic errors, and we have to live with them. That's it.
So
and at some level too, I think that it points to it's a lot of what the anger that we see coming from Putin and the Russian regime is anger at Russian weakness, anger at the weakness of this late Soviet Union and of Russia in the 90s, and the sense of humiliation that goes with that, which humiliation and a sense of being stripped of dignity, which admittedly, I mean, the Soviet Union fell apart not because of the US, but because of decisions made by the leaders of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine in 1991. And in fact, the US was actually working to try to prevent the disintegration of the Soviet Union out of concern for nuclear weapons and other factors as well. But nonetheless, the 90s was a decade of profound economic, social, demographic, political crisis in Russia. And I think that's a lot of what's behind what we're seeing now. This assertion, accompanied by a lot of masculine, sort of macho rhetoric, is also part of what we see going on here now. And so the anger is as much against that decade or so when the leadership in Russia the leadership now in Russia perceives Russia to have been weak and thus unable to secure the guarantees, right? That perhaps today they would be able to secure, being in a more powerful position.
Well, it's certainly over the last couple of years with COVID and the isolation, particularly within Russia, and if you see some of these press conferences or the meetings with Putin sitting at one end of a 50-foot long table, and then he has these 2-hour long tirades. He's worked up, right? He's clearly very angry, very upset about the current order. So let's talk about kind of the more tomorrow question. And Alina, I think I'll start with you here. But what do we think ultimately success looks like for Putin? Not that necessarily that it's relevant, but what is he trying to accomplish by this invasion? Is it a full takeover and decapitation of the current regime? And is it just the Donbass? Is it? I'm having a hard time seeing the other end of this. And what's your view on how this may resolve itself?
Well, look, I mean, obviously, there's a lot of speculation on this very question about what the end goal is with Russia's war against Ukraine. I think it's becoming very clear that it's not just the Donbass, that they want the complete capitulation of Ukraine's democratically elected government, that they're looking to overthrow that government as we speak, as Russian troops surround Ukraine's capital, Kiev. My sense is that they will eventually try to capture Ukraine's democratically elected president and try to force him to surrender and capitulate and everything. And what's the end goal of this attack on Ukraine? Well, it's the sphere of influence that Russia has been seeking to achieve since Putin came to power, basically, and has been seeing that as the big legacy of his rule of Russia. What is the sphere of influence? Well, it's going back to an almost version of the Cold War, where countries on the borders with Russia will not build close relationship with any Western institution, Europe, NATO, whoever, that they will be dependent on Russia. They will look to Russia for help in settling conflicts. And at the end of the day, that Russia has veto power over their desire to choose any other kind of path. And we just saw this recently, for example, in Kazakhstan, where we saw the president of Kazakhstan during protests in that country go directly to Putin and beg him for help. Putin sent in some special forces to settle situations, so to say. And that's exactly the kind of relationship Putin wants. He is the power broker in the region. He is the big power player to whom all these countries should go to first, not Brussels, not Washington, not NATO. And Ukraine wasn't willing to do that. The Ukrainians made it very clear that they weren't interested. In two revolutions, let's remember that, the Orange Revolution early in the 2000s and the Euromaidan Revolution in 2013 and 2014. And so Ukraine was like the sore spot. If you're sitting in the Kremlin, where you have Belarus now is basically a Russian puppet state. You have Central Asian countries that are more or less in line with Russia's agenda. It was looking pretty good. You had Georgia and you had the frozen conflict there that the Russians had started. You have Armenia, Azerbaijan. Those countries weren't going anywhere. Moldova, which now has a democratically elected leaders trying to make some changes, also has this Russian instigating conflict within its borders. But Ukraine just wasn't willing to bend to being part of Russia's sphere of influence. Ukrainian people weren't willing to do that. And that's exactly why we're seeing what we're seeing today. It's basically, if I can't have you, no one can kind of mentality.
So I know we're going to lose you in just a second, Alina. Do you have time for one more or are you out? One more. Okay. What is going to be effective in deterring and stopping Putin? Sanctions? Is it diplomatic action? We've heard about SWIFT. What's your take?
Well, deterrence has failed. Our version of deterrence has failed because we said that we're going to deploy all of these painful sanctions, which are being deployed as we speak against Russia, if Russia invades Ukraine. Russia's invaded Ukraine. They obviously didn't take the sanctions seriously. So that deterrence strategy of using economic pain to deter Russian aggression hasn't worked. As many others have pointed out, including historian Anne Applebaum, unfortunately, the leadership we have in the Kremlin today only understands hard power. And that is a very different kind of world to occupy than the world that has been occupied in the post-World War II era by Europe and the United States, which is based on rules, which is based on diplomacy and solving problems in peaceful ways. And so I think this is why this move by Putin against Ukraine has come as such a shock to the entire transatlantic community. And now the question is, what do we do? Well, clearly we need to rethink in a major way our broader strategic posture and our policy towards Russia, which we haven't had a good policy towards Russia in the US. We've had now at least 4 resets, maybe more if you want to count the Biden administration's desire to try to have a stable and predictable relationship with Russia. Well, Putin looked at that stable, predictable relationship idea, and we know what he said to it. He basically said, well, you want that? Well, I'm going to give you this. So I think we need to really rethink how we are going to have to confront China on one front. That's the long-term challenge, while at the same time continuing to reinforce the alliance, because without the transatlantic alliance, there is no US global leadership. There is no confronting China without Europe. And if we're not invested in Europe as the United States, if we don't have allied unity and cohesion, then forget about the long-term challenge of China. So to my mind, that's what's coming next. And it has to come next. And frankly, Europe has to wake up to the reality that's completely defenseless and completely dependent on the United States for a security guarantee. And I think that is hopefully now being felt in countries that have been very, very complacent in an era of peace and prosperity. I'm sorry, I have to go.
Well, Dr. Polyakova, thank you.
Thank you for
sticking
having
with
me.
us here. Thank you. And so Jeff, it's you
Hi,
and me.
Lena.
It's so I just want to give you an opportunity to chime in if you have any thoughts about kind of where we are, where this is going, but also just the broader context of Europe and the relationship of maintaining some sort of stability, if possible, with Europe, given the history.
Yeah, it might be a little bit out of my wheelhouse.
I can also ask you about the Donbass, but go ahead.
But can I ask you a question, Chris? Because I wanted to, because there's been a lot of writing and talk about cybersecurity, obviously, and that this would be an area, right, that could be a threat to Ukraine, that could be a threat to us. And we know that the Russians have obviously deployed cyber weapons, tested them out, and so forth in recent years against Ukraine. So I wanted to ask you if you could tell us, about that element. Is that being deployed right now? What are the risks? Is Russia too concerned about, what we would do to them that they won't, do it to us?
This is great. The tables have been turned, and I'm happy to talk about this. My prior role with the government spent a lot of time in the post 2016 era of kind of grappling with the various cyber threats that Russia brings to the table. And so we tend to think a lot about the 2016 election and some of the interference efforts there. But, just in December of 2016, right around Christmas time, as well as 2014 Christmas time, the Russians had launched a cyber attack against the Ukrainian electrical grid. And they turned the lights out in the country for a short period of time. And what really has kind of manifested over the last several years is that Russia, with this historical relationship with a degree of animosity that we've heard about between Moscow and Kiev, they have tried to enforce and impose their will. And so they've treated it as a bit of a test kitchen for cyber capabilities, for disinformation operations. And so really, it's not just that it's this moment in time, the last couple weeks or months, but it's the last decade that Russia has been actively pounding away with cyber attacks against Russia. And really, the most notable is 2017, which was the NotPetya attack, which was what looked like ransomware. We've all heard about ransomware. If you're in Virginia, you probably couldn't get gas last summer because of the Colonial Pipeline shutdown. And that was a ransomware operator that was actually shielded and harbored in Russia. So what this all kind of comes around to is that Vladimir Putin has security services and has military intelligence organizations that are very, very capable in the cyber attack space. Very, very capable. And they've used them. They used them in Georgia in 2008. The country of Georgia, when the Russians went in. They used them in 2014, the Russians did when they went into Ukraine. They used them in 2015, 2016, 2017 with that NotPetya. They here in the US, it wasn't just the 2016 election. They didn't stop. They've been probing and trying to find footholds in our critical infrastructure, like our electric grid. And so we know they have capabilities. We know they're very good. We know they use them. We just don't know exactly where this event this invasion is going to go, and is it going to escalate outside of just the borders, the boundaries of Ukraine? But all that said, with our knowledge of their capabilities, with our historical interaction with Ukraine, with some degree of intelligence collection and intelligence community insight, we can make a few bets, right? We can anticipate a few things. And I think What we're considering right now, and based on my understanding of what the U.S. government's concerned about, there are three primary cyber threats that not just to Ukraine, but also to the U.S. that we're worried about. So the first is those direct targeted attacks on critical infrastructure and businesses and government agencies in Ukraine. And we've seen that. Back in January, there was the Russian, Russian and perhaps Belarus agencies. There was a destructive malware attack that was launched. It was January 14th. And then earlier this week, there was another attack. And we don't have attribution just yet. We don't know just yet who did it, but it was designed to destroy, erase computers in banks in Ukraine and government agencies. The problem is, and this gets to the broader risk of cyber attacks and malware, is that the internet's inherently a global ecosystem. And the way networks are connected, it's not like they stop at the water's edge or the international borders. And so if networks are connected, and in this case, there was one organization that had network operations, a computer network in Ukraine, but it also had networks in Lithuania and Latvia that were connected to the Ukrainian networks. And that malware spread from Ukraine into Latvia and Lithuania, who, oh, by the way, are NATO countries. So now there's this question of, is there in NATO Article 5, the self-defense mechanism, really one of those core concepts of NATO, has that been activated? And the answer is no, because it was low level and it wasn't a massive or even a distributed but still significant event. So that's the first thing, is those direct attacks. The other thing that we're really worried about is ransomware. So again, Colonial Pipeline, Russian ransomware actor hits a US organization. Ransomware is a criminal enterprise that has been operating globally, but there are groups that operate with impunity, at least up to recently, out of Russia, and Russia has turned a blind eye. And it's hard to say that after several years of press coverage that the Kremlin doesn't know what's going on. And in fact, I suggest that there is some kind of corrupt alliance between the security services and the ransomware operators. And the reason I say that is because the way the software, the malware is coded, it's engineered, one of the first things it checks for when it compromises a computer or a machine is to see whether the Cyrillic language package is installed on the machine. And if it finds that the user is a Cyrillic or Russian or similar language speaker, then it exits, because it doesn't want to get involved in the domestic affairs and offend the domestic security. So what we're worried about, of course, here then is, as things escalate, as sanctions escalate, that there may be some ransomware actors that either are directed by the Kremlin or they take it upon themselves to go hit US businesses, European and UK businesses. And this is something that even today came up on the internet, where a ransomware group called Conti declared its alignment and affiliation in support of Russia. And that if anyone attacked, whether through cyber or other means, Russia, they would respond and attack that attacking country's critical infrastructure. So it's clear that there's alignment. And then the last thing is, as I mentioned earlier, the Russian security services are very, very good. They're very capable. They've been targeting US networks for years. And while we have made significant progress and we're as secure, frankly, as we've ever been, there's still the possibility they are looking. And so it could be where, as things escalate, if we were to block them from SWIFT, if we were to take other actions like lethal aid support, continued lethal aid support to Ukraine, you could see more destructive and disruptive actions by Russian military assets against US critical infrastructure. That would clearly be escalatory. And now you have that NATO Article 5 concern. So that's kind of the gamut. I frankly have been surprised that the Russians have been as restrained as they have to date using cyber, but that may change. And some of the reports I've been seeing over the day, the last 12 to 24 hours, is that we're starting to see a more frequent occurrence of attacks on critical infrastructure. And I would expect them to kind of lay that information blanket and take internet service out and some of the telecommunications networks out.
So you think it's restraint that we've seen so far, not the effectiveness of defenses? Because I actually was expecting, from some of the worst case scenarios that I was reading about, I was expecting the lights to go out, the mobile system to go down, internet, and so that command and control was basically ineffective. And, being in touch with my friends and colleagues on the ground in Kiev, people are still connected. So is it restraint, do you think, or is it better defenses?
So specific to Ukraine, this is what the cybersecurity community is debating today. Why didn't they do a network blackout in Ukraine as they were about to roll in and the tanks were coming in and the choppers and the airstrikes and the missile strikes? Why didn't they drop it? I mean, one of the theories is that they wanted the world to see the shock and awe campaign. They wanted to see the might of the Russian military come in and crush its enemies in a humiliating and decisive way. Unfortunately, I think if that was the plan, it backfired, frankly, because the Ukrainian people, they're defending their homelands, their families, their ancestry, and they've got something that's different than what the Russian attackers had. They have grit, they have determination. And in some cases, the Russian attackers have been conscripted. They've been threatened to come in. They don't necessarily even know why they're there. And that sort of, that leads to a different outcome. And what you've had then are the iconic moments thus far of this event are Ukrainian stories. So you have the grandmother the other day that approached a Russian soldier and accosted him and said, "Why are you here?" And he was trying to de-escalate. But she said, "You should put sunflower seeds." And the sunflower is the Ukrainian national flower. "You should put sunflower seeds in your pocket because when you die, those seeds will germinate and at least the flowers will bloom." That's just one. The story of Snake Island and the 13 guardsmen that were guarding the island that used a very colorful word to tell the Russian naval fleet what they could go do to themselves. And then is my favorite story, and it's not confirmed, is of this mythical ghost of Kiev, which is a jet fighter pilot who the other day, in one day, shot down 6 advanced fighters, Russian fighters. And we haven't had an ace in any government since the Vietnam War or maybe the World War II. So the stories are falling, the narratives are falling in Ukraine's favor right now, but that's just for now. And we'll see. That the Russians may come in and they may hit the networks and they may take them out.
That's very interesting.
Well, I think, Jeff, we're at time, and Alina, of course, spent the first 45 minutes. I appreciate everyone kind of listening to me kind of narrate here throughout. But thank you to the university for hosting this event. I hope everybody enjoyed it and got something out of it. And Jeff, great to see you. Hopefully, we can do something like this. But in the meantime, let's continue to stand with Ukraine, support Ukraine, and hope everybody has a wonderful weekend.
Thank you, Chris.